I'm Scott Rickard, editor of ACPA Media, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this program on professional development and graduate education, sponsored by the Generativity Committee of the American College Personnel Association. It's also my pleasure to welcome Bob Shaffer, our guest today, for this program. Bob is Professor Emeritus at Indiana University, and really there's no one in our profession who has a better vantage point to view the future of the profession and what we will be like in the 21st century than Bob Shaffer. Today we will be exploring the future of the profession by looking to the past, to our historical roots, and also to the future as we move toward the 21st century. Bob has been in the profession spanning some 6 decades, from the time he's graduated from DePauw University in the late 30s, on to a quarter of a century as a dean at Indiana University, assistant dean, associate dean of students, and for 15 years, dean of students, professor of college student personnel, higher education, and business, chairman of departments of college student personnel and higher education, first president of the American Personnel and Guidance Association in 1951-53. That's just a few of the credits to give you some sense of the perspective that Bob has. And I'd like to begin our discussion, Bob, by looking back to our roots for a moment. You were a graduate student in the late 1930s at Teachers College, Columbia University, after you graduated from DePauw. And that was the time the Student Personnel Point of View was issued by the American Council on Education. What was it like as a graduate student when that document came out? Was there a lot of discussion and debate? Did you feel the excitement of?
Well, I can't say we felt the excitement, but we were taught that. Although it came out as a major report at the time, but we, certainly a beginning graduate student, this was 1937, I think the year was, we just took it as gospel. I suppose as good graduate students, we memorized it. But I can't say there was any debate because I think it solidified the thinking that had been emerging, the best I can make out, because Ed Williamson was a factor in that, and he was the guru of the late 30s and that on how to counsel students and so forth. So we just bought it hook, line, and sinker, I think.
Then the statement was reissued in 1949. You were dean at that time. What was the impact on the profession?
Well, I think we thought that was just a further development of it. That was right after the war. And we realized that with the diversity of students hitting the campuses then, that the original statement referring almost to younger students, all of a sudden we realized that any student fell under the aegis of this philosophy, this individual philosophy, individual development. So I'd say we welcomed it and accepted it again as Bible. And we took it and did. We didn't argue.
You know, you've been a dean, as I indicated in my introduction, for 25 years. What was it like in the early years? Did you have a particular management style? Did you rely on any management theory? Was there any theory at the time that helped you do your job?
I'd like to say yes, and I hope there was. But of course, in the particularly immediate post-war, World War II era, we just did what had to be done because so much was hitting the campus. For example, at Indiana, it doubled its enrollment in less than 7 months and doubled again then within 2 years without any new physical facilities at all. So we, frankly, just worked our tails off. And for example, one of my early jobs, beginning in November of '45, I think it was to establish the Veterans Guidance Center. And we worked 7 days a week, literally. We made appointments on Sunday afternoon because that's when some of the veterans could get there. So the era just demanded you do, and you went and did without thinking a lot about it. Now, for a management style, this was still when the institution was supreme. And I think we all accepted that the institution was the boss. Even the veterans, they may not like the rules and policies and regulations that we all implemented, but they sort of accepted them and griped them, but they'd been used to that. I hope that we later developed a more, a sounder philosophical style of management. But I'd say in that area, it was expedient and satisfied the time.
And a little more authority-based?
I think absolutely. It wasn't until the 60s that, maybe late 50s, that people start saying, you have no right to do this, or what do you mean, or you can't do that. Now, in the earlier days, a lot of those guys didn't plan to abide by the rules that you established, but they didn't tell you quite so bluntly. And there was always a shock the first time a couple students would look me right in the face and say, we refuse to accept that, or that's when the non-negotiable demands came out of the activists who would come out and say, this will be changed today or else. And you'd get hysterical and say, what do you mean or else? And they didn't know themselves often what they meant.
Was it easier to be a student personnel administrator in the early days? Were the roles clear than they are today? There's a lot of continuing debate on what's appropriate roles for the dean or the chief student affairs officer or others who are on the firing line.
Now that's a good question, because it's hard to recall. You did what you had to do, but an awful lot of people didn't like what you did. And you weren't as much of a specialist as you would now. For example, our counseling office, which was one of my early responsibilities, was quite general compared to a counseling and psychological services office of today. And again, we did what the customers, your clients, demanded. Now, whether or not we did philosophically and theoretically the right things, I would judge we didn't, because I think we were quite schizophrenic. Sometimes we were authoritarian, sometimes we'd say, oh, well, we got to help them grow up. And it wasn't until some of this developmental theory came out that we started to analyze the impact of some of our rules and policies, which in effect made us question the authoritarian, if that's what it was, posture of the university vis-a-vis the student.
So in the earlier days, the role conflict that you occasionally read about, and certainly I've experienced and others, of balancing and juggling adversarial and advocacy kinds of roles with students, that wasn't as prevalent?
Certainly wasn't. It was no more than any parent felt. I mean, often, you know, both of us have raised children in our family, and at times you're too permissive, at times you're too authoritarian. I think we had that schizophrenia or that role conflict, but it wasn't that adversarial role. Your student leaders would come in, they may not agreed with the old dean, but they usually left pretty polite. And I remember I used to play for my seminar a tape where, to my knowledge, the first student activist said to me very forthrightly, he says, I don't have to be polite to you, and he wasn't, but the fact he felt obligated to say that to me showed that in his mind he was just feeling his oats for the first time. And it was a very interesting posture. And then, of course, we started using the vile terms, which are almost, just causes our hair to turn gray.
Which are more commonplace.
Exactly. But they just loved to use them because they just knew that the old dean was nonplussed by being called this and that and so forth.
When you were a dean, did you have difficulty with this juggling the advocacy roles? Was that a problem?
Every now and then, because you work with the student leaders, and that was one of the things I tried to do very much. I had a student leadership course, I got acquainted with the student leaders, and I really tried to work with them. But then when they would turn out to be your adversary publicly, it was always a shock. And I remember one time a fellow who's still my lifelong friend came in and said, now look, when we have that meeting, I'm going to have to do this and this and this. And he, in effect, was apologizing in advance for what he was going to call me then. Posturing. Because he was going to say, you are representing a hypocritical, untrustworthy administration. I'm going to have to paint you as the spokesman. He says, I know you don't believe in this, but he says, that's what I'm going to have to say. And we had an interesting debate in public, and I lost the debate, as you can imagine. because the dean often did have to do certain things in those days that he or she was not pleased about doing.
You were on the point.
Sure, as you are now in many cases.
What brought you your greatest satisfaction when you were a dean?
Well, this is a tough one. My own personal satisfaction due to maybe my orientation in personnel management and believe it or not, Boy Scout training, which I used to be in, was staff development. I'm the proudest, I think, of all of both the growth of student leaders and growth of staff members that have been on my staff or with me and my staff, and who've now gone on to much higher professional development than I ever did. I think that's the most single greatest source of satisfaction.
Well, staff development's as important today. Do you have any suggestions that the things that worked then that still might work today? What?
I hope we do. And to me, that's the key to survival for the next 50 years, that unless staffs grow together, unless people, you're not quite as old as I am, but you are a senior administrator, unless we learn that our young staff members may have the answers that we don't have, we're going to go down the drain. So I certainly believe that the emphasis on staff development is more important now than even in that hectic period following World War II or the very hectic period of the activist age. And there are techniques, involvement, openness, but I'd say it dare not be left to just extra time. It should be scheduled, should be evaluated, and it should be absolutely insisted upon. It's not a nice thing to do. It is the top professional demand right now.
Any topics or issues that you think are particularly important for staff development, for staff to be concerned with today, in the future, and in the future?
I sure hope so, because I think, again, if we don't look to the future in the new era that's emerging, we're going to be obsolete. So I think one is an image of student personnel, an image of student affairs as a positive educational force, as opposed to the prevalent image of a custodial supportive service. And how you change that image on any particular campus, I'm not sure I know, but I'm convinced it has to be done. That's one. Two is we have to come to grips with this new adulthood of the traditional age college student. When we mention the adult in higher education now, too many people think of the older student, whereas in reality, with the 18-year-old majority of 1972, we still have not responded educationally to that. And I think we're going to have to learn how to treat these college students as adults, but also make them assume the responsibilities of adults. And this we've not done. We've been trying to act like in loco parentis at the same time we were denying it. And some of the even legal cases coming out now, the recent Denver decision, where it held that the university was responsible for this man's use of the trampoline, which I think will be overthrown in the appeal. But nevertheless, this shows even the courts still hold us in loco parentis a little bit. So I think that's a major issue. Another one is this whole question that you and I were discussing earlier on motivation. Of all people, student affairs people should be the ones who are skilled in motivating people to high achievement.
Particularly students.
Particularly students and staff. So why should we leave it to the coaches to be famous for this? And I'm just convinced that if we, in student affairs, learn how to reward positively and motivate and lead people to living up to their potential, we will be such an effective force on the college campus that our future is going to be brighter than it's ever been in the history of our whole higher educational experience.
Bob, you touched on the status of student affairs, and I think that's been a continuing issue in our profession. The acceptance or lack of on some campuses. Is that a topic that could be addressed with faculty as far as staff development?
It certainly has to be. And we're at fault in part of this, because we, in effect, beginning with the era of specialization, both told the faculty in some cases, well, this is our area, you just let us handle it. And then two, we rewarded the faculty for not being interested in it. Publications and research was the big deal. Faculty said they hire those old deans to take care of that. So we've let them get away with not being involved with student development. Now then, we're going to have to learn how to work with the faculty and fellow administrators in creating this total environment, wherever it is. Now, this doesn't mean limiting the environment, because with the information age, that era is past. But it means creating an environment that has stimuli and motivating forces that the student selects, and that the faculty member helps him select. So I'd favor, for example, using faculty member to study the image of student affairs, study the self-image of prevalent among students on a campus. They see themselves as irresponsible youngsters in many cases. Look at some of the hijinks they get away with. They don't see themselves as responsible adults. And we've let them in orientation and in our handling of discipline, we've let them get away with it. So a lot of it's our fault.
So you would reach out to faculty to, rather than keeping at a distance?
Absolutely. Again, to mention my Boy Scout experience, we always had the saying, you want 10 men to do the job, not 1 man to do 10 men's work. We must create opportunities and avenues for faculty involvement, whether they want to be or not. And they do. They want to be involved. Advertising, marketing people, organizational theorists, organizational behavior people, some of our sociologists can help us greatly. But we, in a way, have not used them effectively. And just to tell some faculty member, come over and have dinner with the boys or the girls, that's not rewarding. As important that is, I favor that, but we've got to use their expertise, and by involving them, they will make a very positive contribution to student life that now is often not made.
Part of staff development can, of course, be evaluation, which you've mentioned, and you've written on the subject, and as I recall, you've mentioned that it's typically informal or haphazard. Should we be increasing our emphasis on evaluation?
Absolutely. The message is very simple in this day and age. If we do not evaluate our work effectively and our growth effectively, someone else will do it for us, much less skillfully. It'll be the accountants, it'll be the controllers, it'll be the outside people on a public image. So unless we get a hold of this job, and the techniques and the methods aren't the key thought, the idea is the concept. Right now in our field, the bottom line is an epithet almost that we use against business and others. We'd better determine what the bottom line in student affairs is, and then stand for that visibly and assertively, and evaluate our achievement in accomplishing it, rather than standing by and say, well, you can't evaluate what I do, because that's self-defeating. We can postulate, for example, what we do. Every staff member ought to know what he or she is doing. So let's start saying that, and at least when you meet with your staff then, you say, well, how do you evaluate your work this semester? And I don't know all the answers to this, but I do know that as a field, we'll have to come up fast. I'd say within 5 to 10 years, or else we will be relegated to buildings and grounds and the control and the accounting office level. And I'm not denigrating that. I'm just saying we are a positive educational force, but we've not yet been able to demonstrate it visibly.
Now, one of the ways that the 70s has been characterized and the 80s has been the age of the consumer. Right. Should students be involved in evaluating programs and professional staff? Do they have a role?
Absolutely. Absolutely, but not in the normal consumers. I'm very unhappy with permitting the consumer relationship. Students are our colleagues with us in the search for knowledge. That sounds idealistic, but that's a fact. The moment you let a student sit there and think he's just buying time in a class and or a product, we have the wrong educational relationship. Yet we've fallen for that in part. Now, students are not dumb. They know when they're getting an educational experience or not, and I think we should involve them effectively, but interpret to them their responsibility in that involvement. So let's say you're a dean, a dirty old dean, as the saying always used to go. I've found that students will often say, well, I don't agree with the dean on this, but he at least stood for this. Whereas today, so many of us, because of the fear of the consumer reaction, don't stand for anything. Afraid of, quote, quote, afraid of the reaction.
I'm reminded of John Gardner's notion in excellence that we shouldn't trust ourselves to be adequately self-critical, and I sense that this is what you're talking about with being open and involving students in evaluating what's going on, because after all, it's their education.
And because we feel often a student can't be educated without us, well, of course, they do grow and develop whether we were there or not. So it's very important that we see ourselves more of a role as a coach in that, or a stimulus, not as the achiever. I'm a John Gardner man. I urge our audience to read everything he has written.
When you were on the firing line, Bob, what were your, did you have any disappointments, things that you felt were built into the job that kept you from doing what you wanted to do? Or
Oh, man.
what are the pitfalls in this profession?
Well, this is very hard to answer because almost by the day you have a pitfall. One is not to take yourself too seriously. I think many deans literally thought the weight of the world was on their shoulders in not only the 60s, but even with the drug scene and dropout scene of the early 70s. And now, with the world as it is, it will certainly bow us over if we take all the problems on. Also, you have your failures, obviously. It's very difficult to work with a student and have him or her not respond. In other words, actually be deceptive or dishonest in the relationship. But if a student were here, if you and I were, if you were a student I was talking with you, they'd say, but deans are dishonest and deceptive. So I'd say the pitfall again is when sometimes the institutional relationship makes you be something other than you want to be. And I feel that with the information age that we have now, particularly with that, we have to be very open. No longer can we have any secret hidden agendas or secrets. And I think Animal House, despite its unfortunate references, the double secret probation that the dean opposes is a good example of some perceptions of our field. So I feel now that the biggest pitfall is trying to think that we can work below the deck, from underneath the deck or below the card table. We've got to be open, we've got to be above board, and we have to be direct, I think, in most cases.
Is that suggesting that we ought to make our values more explicit?
Absolutely.
What we stand for?
Absolutely. Yeah, as the old saying goes, you can't teach a dog to do a trick until you know what trick you want him to do. We cannot possibly teach students unless we have some model or some vision of who we want those students to be when they graduate. And I think this does have to be explicit. Now, this doesn't mean you, in an authoritarian way, impose that model upon them. But it certainly means that you interpret to them what a graduate of this institution is. And this is what an educated person is. And these are the hallmarks of an educated person. When I was in training, in fact, T.V. Smith, I think then of Chicago, a philosopher, wrote a very significant paper, The Marks of an Educated Man. That was sexist language, but that's what they used in those days. That is a piece that still I carry in my mind, because college students should be different than non-college students from having been there. Yeah. Yet we're permitting the feeling to be abroad that, well, I don't want to be different if I don't, and I don't have to be if I don't want to be.
Are you suggesting then that there's still a role for in loco parentis?
Well, see, I would deny that's in loco parentis, although obviously I'm caught on that. To my mind, Neil Johnson, a vice president of the National Student Association, started the modern debate of in loco parentis in 1954 when he put it on the agenda of the Congress of the NSA. No dean used to sit down and say, no, I'm going to be in loco parentis. He just did, he or she just did what had to be done. Now, today we need to interpret that role, and my good friend Professor Samuel Braden, or President Samuel Braden at that time of Indiana State, developed beloved advisor. In other words, we are advisors and coaches, maybe. Teachers are that. Now, if they want to denigrate that by calling it in loco parentis, so be it. I would be happy to be considered the parents of some of the brilliant people in this world that developed at my institution or at your institution.
Bob, one of the historical roles of administrators has been that of a control agent. It's come out of the in loco parentis part of our work. How do you see that in the future? Because it seems that That was a problem in the 60s with protests, and we seem to have an increase in the political activity on the campuses. Any thoughts on where that may be leading in the future and our roles?
I sure have some thoughts on it. There's no question our heritage is one of control. The old dean of men and dean of women are viewed as people who control the behavior of students. And we still get, of course, as you well know, requests now or inquiries why you can't keep the students from doing this or that, or why do you permit the students to drink, is a typical question on some campuses. Now, in the future, I think we have to shed that image, not that we lose control, but that we have to gain control by working with students, who are now adults, to achieve a commonly set objective. And I think that those of us who try to perpetuate control are just in trouble, because with the modern information age, with the wide range of mobility and everything, we've lost control if that is our objective. Yet interpreting that to our president or to public, to newspaper editors, is a very difficult question. And I think this is one of the major issues facing the field, how to respond to an era when the old-fashioned control will not work. And parents are facing this even.
So is the notion less of a control agent as in a parenting sense, but more of a partner,
exactly,
a colleague?
And motivating sense. A motivated person is under control because he or she has an objective. So if we work with an individual to set a common objective, to achieve something, whether it's their ability to speak in public or the way to write English or to think through an issue, then the control comes by adopting a common objective. And that's where I think we failed in many cases. And even some of these reports on higher education coming out now seem to refer back to the old age of get tougher, be more rigorous, make them study. Yeah. And you just don't do it that way in this day and age, for the common person, that is.
Well, this question of roles has been a theme in our profession for a long time. Yes. And I recall Bob Brown's really landmark monograph, 1972, Tomorrow's Higher Education, Return to the Academy, in which he suggests a number of new roles for the profession to replace the housekeeping and the custodial roles that I think we would like to shed, but that seem to continue. That's part of our legacy and the perceptions of what we do, whether it be from parents, faculty, or students. Right. Do you recall those roles he mentioned, and to what extent they've perhaps been incorporated in our work? Applied behavioral scientist was one, a programmer, a consultant. Are these really viable roles today? Are they?
Absolutely. I think that Bob Brown's work, as you say, was a real landmark, and it's still as applicable today as it was, what, 15 years ago almost now.
Yes.
And I would urge every one of us in the field to read that annually and discuss it at a staff meeting. Not that any one person's going to adopt any one role, and Bob never meant that. He meant do these things as you did your work. Yes. And I think where some people misinterpreted it was he thought that, some people thought he was saying you did this or this. You do all of these, you perform all of these roles. And the Return to the Academy has an interesting concept. We came out of the Academy. Dean Briggs at Harvard was an esteemed faculty member. Early deans of men and dean of women, Dean Scott Goodnight, and others were esteemed faculty members. Bob Strozzi at Chicago was an esteemed faculty member of French, of all things. Now we have to return to that, but in the modern era. We aren't going to return as the scholar, prodigal son or daughter, but we ought to return to the academy, meaning that the academy is the most single important influence in that young person's life at that time.
It should continue to be central.
Exactly. And yet with the modern world, with TV, cassettes, travel, and all that, we cannot limit the environment. So we got to motivate them to choose from this broad smorgasbord of experiences that a young person can choose from, to choose those that contribute to his or her development. And that is a major challenge. It's motivation, it's reward, it's even getting the university to agree on what's important.
So are you suggesting then perhaps some new roles? One would be a motivator.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Motivator, evaluator, coach, and in part I'm trying to figure out how to help people, even us, set our own individual objectives and goals, both in the short term, by the semester, by the year, or even by the month, and the long term. Where do I want to be 5 or 10 years from now? Because with the world changing so fast now, unless we have some guide, we feel buffeted about by experience, by budget cuts, by threats from the public, by newspaper editorials, and we feel like we have no control over our profession, over our professional activities.
One of the topics that's been another theme in our literature has been terminology. Roles is one, terminology, what we call ourselves, what we identify with.
Right.
Student services, student affairs, student development. Did you have any thoughts on the importance of that, where we're headed?
Well,
does it matter?
I wish I had a definitive answer, because there just is no answer. It seems I'm generally using student affairs now for the broad field, student development for a particular aspect of it. Obviously, you're in administration, and your current role, at least by nominal. But I don't know what the ultimate is. People smirk when you say student affairs. That means as if we're supposed to keep the men and women from getting together. And that harks back to this custodial role again. And yet student services has a crass affair, supportive services that, like the janitor sweeps the floor, you clean up the beer cans under the bushes. So I honestly don't know what the field is.
Student development may cause other problems.
Well, yes, particularly if we claim we're the only ones that contribute to student development. I think that makes the faculty matter than any single thing we've done. That we acted like the faculty did not contribute to student development, and some don't, I might add, but I don't say that to them. But most do, and we got to accept it. But we're trying to coordinate, direct, to stimulate that development, campus-wide. And I would like to think even trustees saw themselves as contributing to student development. Now that's quite removed from their normal thought, but they should in their role modeling and in what things they thought were important.
Of course, the most recent example of this continuing discussion, debate, if you will, disagreement over terminology is the caste standards. And I know it was broadly discussed and debated heatedly, and finally they decided on student services / development, as I assume as a compromise, rather than perhaps an alternate term would have been student affairs.
That compromise probably causes the English teachers in our midst to be spinning their graves. I think I'm for caste standards. I think it's a good impetus for our field, but it's not going to solve our problems any more than the standards for accrediting solve the higher education standards. Look at all the reports that have come out in the last 2 or 3 years on excellence in higher education, when you would think that our accrediting standards just a few years ago ensured that. If you're accredited, you're excellent. Well, we know that doesn't work that way. So I would say each of us should read those standards very carefully, choose from those that we agree with and implement very energetically, know why we reject any if we do, although for the moment I don't find any that I truly reject. I think some of them are somewhat idealistic, and for us to think that our presidents are going to drop dead on our budget request and acquiesce to every one of our requests to meet all those standards is just idealistic or unrealistic. But I think it's a good thing for us to know what an ideal situation might be in the lives of some people.
Perhaps incorporate in staff development.
Every staff member should know how he or she fits into those standards and what he or she contributes and what his or her job contributes to them. Now, they may say, look, I don't do this. You never even asked me to do this. Well, that's so. In some situations, we have different job definitions. But we should know the general classification.
A related issue to standards is perhaps the broader issue is whether we're a profession. You know, that's been debated with equal fervor over the years, and are we a profession?
No, I don't think we are at all, and some of my good friends have written very eloquently about that issue, and I think the first real discussion I remember personally was Gil Wren spoke on that about 1948. I'm not concerned at all that we are not a profession as defined by the occupational sociologist. specialized body of knowledge, control over entrance in the field, certain things of that type. I hope we are professional in the connotative term, the colloquial term. I hope we use the results of scholarly disciplines very carefully and very effectively, which I'm not sure we do. But I'm just not interested in arguing with anybody whether or not we're a profession. The college president is not a professional. There's no profession of college president, yet he or she's a very significant person. A lot of people in this world are very significant people, but not professionals in the technical definition. So I would urge young people not to try to get their status, young people in our profession, to try to get their status by saying, I'm in a profession. I hope they realize they're in a very significant occupation that can contribute to the individual's development, make them better for the fact that we have been there and interacted with them, and then take the satisfaction in that, and let those who worry about it go somewhere else and worry about it.
Yeah. Well, this evolving field or profession, whatever we want to call it, seems to be it has three facets, three dimensions to it: counseling and administration, and now the growing body of theory, which is called generally student development. Do you see that? Should graduate preparation programs be emphasizing all three? Or?
Absolutely, in my opinion, absolutely. I came out of counseling, of course, so I regard counseling as a core. I'm a Gilbert Wren, Ed Williamson product in that sense, in my own training. Therefore, I see that, but that's possibly obsolete by today's world. Not that it's unimportant, but there are other things as important. Services and student development, the student development theory is being defined very rapidly now. I don't know whether it's definitively, but we ought to be aware of all these emerging definitions. I, of course, like to add on here also organizational development, contribution to organizational effectiveness. I'm beginning to think that that may be an emerging role that we really have to come to grips with. If we do not contribute to the total effectiveness of our institution, then we are negligent. So again, preparation for our field is so broad that an individual must get his or her confidence by knowing that individuals should be confident, they're knowing they're competent in an area, then constantly expand their area and always grow. The moment in our work, the moment anyone thinks I am prepared, they're dead. Both effectively, they're dead mentally, in my opinion. Because look what's coming out. Every week there's material that we have to study and examine and think. And every staff should be bringing to the staff meetings these recent reports, news items, evidences of public images that are not accurate. And so I think it's very broad. But those three areas you mentioned are certainly the traditional areas of at least consideration of preparation.
Well, with this growing body of theory, have you seen, in your perspective, that professionals are more effective because they have a theory base? Have you seen it? Since the 70s, we've had this explosion of knowledge in the field. Since Penny's article in the last decade and a half. Has that made a difference in how well
the field has been?
How well we do the job?
It's hard to know because higher education has changed so much in that same period. Because we'll never be the same again after the 60s and the 18-year-old majority. Never be the same as we were before World War II and the impact of the veterans. So it's hard to really know. But yes, I think we definitely are doing a better job because we have a clear understanding of what the outcomes are. Maturity, self-direction in the student, some moral judgment, some outlook of growth, how I want to plan my growth as a young person, some rewards that come with being a cultured person in a society that doesn't reward this very much. Now, we need to make a lot of headway in this, though, fast. And how we evaluate our work will depend upon the people who are coming along right now. I certainly evaluate with a very high mark, but many college presidents and many budget officers think that we're a waste of money, if not worse.
Would you see theory as being a foundation for the future?
As the guide to the solution to this problem. In other words, if we cannot defend the work we do based upon sound theory and conceptual approach to education, we better change our work, because that's our business. But if we think only that we are the only ones concerned with this, then we're very narrow indeed, because business is concerned with it. All the public institutions of our society have to be concerned with it.
So is this new constellation of theories, if you will, is it really a way of implementing the student personnel point of view that we've had?
I think it's a way of giving us guideposts to further developments. And which particular theory one uses, I don't think is truly relevant, because probably we're going to have to apply some theories to some types of development, moral judgments, handling conflicting goals, and other types of theory where maybe using Skinnerian psychology, we just simply use a reward system to elicit behavior we want.
Are there any particular theories that you've read that, and looking back over your career, you say, gee, I wish I would have known that earlier. I really could have used that knowledge in certain situations?
I hate to call it theory, but I think the biggest concept that hit me was Carl Rogers coming out in Counseling and Psychotherapy, which I believe, if my memory is about 1946, which used the involvement and the interrelationship in counseling as opposed to the directive counseling method. I'm afraid I had gotten the idea that a counselor diagnosed the situation for the client and told that client what to do about it. I hope I'm wrong, but I have the feeling that was where I was going. But then Carl came out with this...
That was more the directive approach.
Well, that's what it was labeled as for good debating purposes, right? I'd claim, and I was directive, I think, in that age. The non-directive, which I think maybe has also been exaggerated a little bit at times, but nevertheless is a good argument, taught me, at least I hope, that two people can work together and emerge with a goal in mind without one person telling the other against his or her will that this is where you're going to go. And I think, to me, that was the most single one. Now, I do like, again, as I mentioned, Art Chickering's Vectors just as a conceptual scheme for human growth. And his later book on adult development and some of these other Gross, Kohlberg's theories of value formation and stuff are all very important. I am not clear in my own mind, since I'm now very much of a generalist, how they apply to specific functions in our field.
Well, one of the values of the profession has been a commitment to diversity. Right. Serving the diversity within our student body, particularly. How do you see that? Are we doing a good job in meeting our commitments to our diverse constituencies?
I think we have, better than most fields in academia. But I'm very pleased with our field in general. And I think we hope we can continue emphasizing that and maybe get academia to come along. You go to a lot of campuses, many departments don't even have women, let alone blacks and other minorities, and let alone other races. Or you go to some departments, they don't even know the Pacific Rim exists. They still think Western Europe is the seat of all knowledge. And now when the Middle East is coming to our focus so much, we wonder, where's that? Who are those people and what do they believe? And as you know, I worked in Malaysia a little bit recently, and I'm very struck with the strength of the conservative Islamic movement. Now, we better understand this, because this is a force that's sweeping the world. Yet many times we are caught flat-footed because we've been so narrow in our own views that we haven't informed ourselves to begin with, and more particularly, don't understand.
Opportunities for advancement in our profession, or perhaps even employment, seem to be fewer today than they were in the past. There's less growth in higher education, there's less turnover. What advice can you give?
Well, I'm just glad I'm a old gray-haired has-been on this one, because in the 50s and 60s, the field was growing so fast that there are always demand for more staff, more jobs, and promotion. Now, even if every college and university in the country had a chief student affairs officer, not all of them do, there are what, about 3,200. There are roughly 60, 70,000 student affairs personnel in higher education today. And I imagine you don't plan to retire at least next year. So how fast is there promotion? That pyramid is very narrow.
Nor should the chief student affairs officer be viewed necessarily as the epitome of the profession.
That's what we got to change. I was one of those who always wanted to be a chief student affairs officer, and I went right to it. Today, I think you may have to set other sights, and this may mean we go into other fields, community agencies, or go into business, or maybe be a financial aid specialist, a director of counseling center, director of activities, and that be the top job. Not everybody can be a chief student affairs officer with this pyramid where there are only, let's say, 2,000 people at the top of a field that has a very broad base. But yes, I think if we keep our preparation broad and keep our development broad, as in our reading and our professional contacts, personal professional contacts, then we don't have to worry about the future. But if we think one job and one job title is the only source of our future job satisfaction, then we're in trouble.
Well, I sense you're saying that we advise our students to think of perhaps 2 or 3 career changes, and why shouldn't we be applying the same concept to our own field?
Precisely. We're teaching now that the person in the future will have, what, more than that, even 5 or 6 jobs. And yet, here we act like my career would be typical. See, I've been at Indiana now 45 years, and essentially it was a straight line progression. Well, that'll not be characteristic of professional careers in our field in the future.
So if you were starting out in the profession now, as a young professional, what would be your agenda for leadership, the things that you think we ought to be focusing on in the future?
Well, that's hard to know because I think it depends on any one campus and your own personal interest. I would start out, I think, taking an interest in the total campus environment as an educational force and become skilled. Or that's a matter of organizational theory. It might be called educational psychology in terms of motivation, or it might be called anthropology. I don't know what field of preparing.
Looking at the total institution.
That's right, looking at the total institution. And I would become visibly significant in some aspect of it. This means evaluation. It might mean helping people get interested in cultural and aesthetic activities and rewarding them for it. Just think what would happen if we would make it as popular and as publicly acclaimed to be active in drama and debate and musical activities as we do in athletics. Our society would be enriched. Yet here we sit now heaping accolades on the athlete. Now, I'm not against that. I happen to have been a minor athlete myself. But I am for this breadth, and society is demanding it. So I would, again, urge, let's start in, let's work with individuals, let's help them be better than they even can aspire to be. And we can do that.
What should the student personnel professional be an expert in?
I think all these fields. I think the entry-level job, you have to have a specialty. Residence halls, financial aids, career development, activities, something. But then the person who restricts himself to that is in a dead end. And I can't emphasize to young people that if you are on a staff that does not have an active staff development program, start one yourself. In this world, as fast-moving as it is, you can't afford to be stagnant for even 2 years. And yet I've known people who've been out 2 years that hadn't read a book since they left the field. And I always ask my graduates, what are you doing these days? And by that I mean, what are you doing that's different? And I hope to go back and teach these. That's where I learn, I hope, from them.
Perhaps then a role you see for the future would be a role that students played in the 60s, to be an activist.
Absolutely, absolutely. How can anyone look at the world today and not be an activist? The insane things that are going on.
To be involved.
To be involved in it. And for the moment, I'm not arguing now to be involved in any one side. But the person who isn't involved right now deserves to be an insignificant bit of protoplasm on this earth. And I think absolutely we must encourage our young people to be involved, to be activists.
Be informed.
And be informed. That's part of the information age. They must be informed, but they can't be inundated with all these facts and stuff. And oh, absolutely. I think deans should be seen as people encouraging others to express themselves. And it's always a source of great disappointment when I hear of deans who are thought of as repressors. Students say, well, you couldn't say that here. We must encourage in this age people to speak up and be interested.
So as we look to the future of the profession and the roles we play, would that be a role that you think we increasingly...
In conflict resolution, I'm very disappointed so many young people now resort to fistfights. Residence halls, I'm told that the occurrence of actual fistfights in residence halls increasing. Or physical assaults on women, not just rape, but beating them. That's a failure to understand how you resolve differences. And of course, I'm bitterly disappointed at what appears to be acceptance by much of the public of our country, that war and resort to war and violence is an acceptable means to resolve differences. So yes, I think a major role in the future in our field is to teach people how to live like educated, civilized individuals, and you don't go killing them off or bombing indiscriminately or gassing them or starving them.
Well, how do you see the future of the profession?
Well,
are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm very optimistic, because just from what we're saying here, just think of the challenges it faces, and look at the brilliant young people coming to our field. They're going to respond. Now, how what the exact response is, I don't know, just as we didn't know in post-World War period. Robert Hutchins, characterized the GI Bill as a great mistake. And he said universities would become nothing but jungles, the hobo jungles of the educational world. Yet that act of encouraging over 1 million GIs to go back to college, or go to college, not necessarily back, was one of the best things for this country to ever happen. Now, in the future, where we're going to encourage people to be learners all their lives, whether the idea of college will be years, not just 4 years, but it will be 10, 20 years, always learning. Just think what an opportunity there is for people in our field.
Well, Bob, in this year, 1987, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Student Personnel Point of View Statement of 1937.
And coming out with a new one.
Is that statement, that original document, still current today? Is it still timely?
In my opinion, I know the theorists will argue with it, and I do think it's fun to go through this activity we're going through now. I'll be writing another one maybe for the next 50 years. But the concepts involved of individual attention by the institution and individual development, which is really maybe a new term, but nevertheless that's conveyed in that, are absolutely solid. Because again, there's no more self-defeating thing educationally than to have an institution to regard all its students as just little blocks of raw material to be formed in a manufacturing process. We know people don't develop that way, they don't learn that way, and we'd better not treat them that way.
You've been in Indiana 45 years. How have you maintained your obvious enthusiasm and interest over that time? What's the secret?
Well, I don't know if there's any secret. That's an interesting thought, because a lot of my friends say, my heavens, are you still there? And for me, it's worked out very well. I love that institution. I love the people connected with it. I enjoy the community. To me and to my wife, that was a very important part of our life. Now, others may want different environments and different settings. And all I can say is, don't always think the grass is greener elsewhere, but don't get, as maybe I did, get so imbued with the local situation that you don't see any grass anywhere else. I had opportunities to move, but I think I mentioned earlier as we were talking, the ones who wanted me I didn't want, and the ones I wanted, they didn't want me.
Well, perhaps your enthusiasm and your success, Bob, is related to that phrase that George Koo used in the article in the ACD Journal, where he described you as the quintessential do-gooder. How do you feel about that term?
Well, I think George and Mike Coombs, who wrote that, picked up the theme in my career. I've always wanted to be known as the person or as an individual, who felt that his presence should make a difference in the lives of others. And that's led me to a lot of troubles in this world, as you know, because it gets you in trouble when you have that view. But the rewards from that, whether it's in youth work, or whether it's in education, or whether it's in politics, it is rewarding to know that you're at least trying to make a difference. It seems to me like the most deadening influence in this world today is the feeling of some young people that they don't make a difference. Just think what a disheartening thing that is in this world. And my theme right now, almost my work, is to make people realize that they do make a difference, and it starts with them. Whether it's peace, or whether it's ecology, or whether it's resolving the hatred between individuals and races, whether it's resolving conflict by rationality rather than by violence, whether war or whether fist fights. We do make a difference, and I'm convinced that our field can make that contribution in the lives of other people.